works for you. It's always nice to see some faces as we are in the room, and I think the room begins to light up as we go on. And I think we are ready to kick off and start in about a minute. All right. Good afternoon. I should start with the morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our friends in Asia Pacific. We apologize that we always have to keep you late this time of the night every Tuesday, as we have over the last couple of weeks. But we are riding along this journey. As you are all aware, this is part of the certificate program on the Global Compact for Migration. And we are also just excited every Tuesday afternoon to be able to host these webinars where we invite also other speakers, other colleagues, other scholars and friends of the migration and diaspora space to discuss all things related to migration and all things related to the Global Compact on Migration. As we have done in the last 3 weeks, we dive into each of these objectives in a very deep way, as deep as we can, and we have the aid of an able panelists that joins us every week. That helps us to take a deep dive, depending on their areas of expertise, research, as well as the knowledge that they have on the particular subject. Today, we'll be looking at the Global Compact for Migration objective number 4, which seeks to ensure that all migrants have proof of legal identity and adequate documentation. And the text from the Global Compact is quite ambitious, and I'm glad that not just the panelists that we have in the room, but also I guess from our participants will be able to hear, from the floor how that has been going on since 2018, when the Global Compact, when the GCM was signed by quite a large number of countries in Morocco. And so these countries committed to fulfill the right of all individuals to a legal identity by providing all our nationals with proof of nationality and relevant documentation, allowing national and local authorities to ascertain a migrant's legal identity upon entry, during stay, and for return, as well as to ensure that there's an effective migration procedures and efficient service provision and improved public safety. We further to commit to ensure through appropriate measures that migrants are issued adequate documentation and civil registry documentation, such as birth, marriage, and death certificates at all stages of migration, as a means to empower migrants to effectively exercise their human rights. And I'm just reading the commitment part, as there are other elements that try to break that commitment into some very clear sub-objectives. And very glad that this afternoon we're joined by 3 speakers. We have Nicole Constable, who is a professor and chair of anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh in the United States. We have Nana Gamfi, who is the executive director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And we have Neil McCain, who is from the United Nations Legal Identity Agenda Task Force based in the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So these are our 3 panelists, and together with the participants and the students, I think we will be able to unpack what exactly this has meant for countries that have taken on this very important goal, or positioning themselves to be able to provide proof of legal identity and adequate documentation for all migrants. Just checking again, Nana, if you're here with us, just give us a hand raise. That would be good to know that you're here as we continue, so that we can have smooth sailing. The chat box is open for your reflections and your comments. It's very nice to know where people are based and where they're coming from. And now I guess we can also dive into just share your reflections as presentations are being made and as deliberations are being shared. We will have the opportunity to have a Q&A, as we always do, and we leave a lot of ample time for that, because not only would we like to read your questions, we would like to hear from you. So we will have an interaction between the participants and the panelists. So we look forward to that towards the end of the session. And in the meantime, I know that you may have a burning issue. Please feel free to write it down on the chat, and it can be repeated again during the Q&A session. We ask that you keep your microphones muted. Your videos are very welcome for us to be able to see you so that we can have an active engagement. So let's just kick off and ask Nicole as she's, settling into her seat there. I will just introduce Nicole. Nicole has a master's and a doctorate degree from the University of California in Berkeley, and she's a professor of the chair. She's a professor and the chair of anthropology. She's also professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and Asian studies, as well as a research professor in the University Center for International Studies at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. She has a number of visiting scholars, and one recently is a senior visiting scholar at the Asian Research Institute, which is at the National University of Singapore. She has authored or co-authored quite a number of books, some that are quite interesting, and one I think some of her publications that we'll be hearing much more about in relation to our topic today. These books include Made to Order in Hong Kong, Stories of Migrant Workers, Romance on a Global Stage, Virtual Ethnography and Mail Order Marriage, Born Out of Place, Migrant Mothers and the Politics of International Labor. And apart from these books, she has also authored quite a number of articles related to gender and labor, and also looking at gendered mobilities and immobilities in East and Southeast Asia. So she will be talking to us more about her Southeast Asian experiences in this call today. And Nicole, we are really excited to have you. Thank you for honoring us with your time today. And I wonder if you could just kick us off and dive us into what you think are some of the major problems and challenges concerning this accurate identity documentation that you learned about in the course of your ethnographic research when you were working on Indonesian migrant workers. Over to you. The floor is yours, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Patty, for that lovely introduction. And it is my pleasure to be here today with all of you. It was really an honor to be invited. So jumping right in, my ethnographic research in the last few decades has been mostly among Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong. But this particular project that I'm working on that's most relevant to this GCM Objective 4 is a book that I'm writing right now about Indonesian migrant workers and their passports, and in particular passports that are known as ASPAL documents. And ASPAL is a contraction of Asli Tapi Palsu, which means real but fake passports. And the work explores how they came to have what are called ASPAL, or real but fake passports, and what the underlying problems are with the regularizing or correcting of migrant workers' documents, their identity documents in particular. So I look into the roots of the problem, and in a sense, mine is a cautionary tale about how, in particular, the correction of documents can, if done in a particular way, cause greater problems for migrant workers than resolving them or protecting them. And so I focus on a particular case of several years of the process of correcting or regularizing passports among Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong by the Indonesian consulate, and how in some ways that went wrong and caused problems for a number of domestic workers who were then investigated for immigration fraud and ended up in prison. And even though there are over 100 or roughly 150,000 or more Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong, and maybe a dozen or so ended up in prison, the wider context of this renewal of identity documents really caused problems. Many thousands of women ended up going home. Others had to try to purchase at a higher price documents to support their existing passports. And So my interest is in the roots of these problems. So it's one thing to claim to guarantee birth, marriage, and death documentation, and especially birth documentation for newborns. But for people who are already in their 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s and who never had birth certificates and who had to obtain them many years after the fact, and who have to use brokers to do their migration, then they're very much at the mercy of those brokers and, in many cases, corrupt immigration officials who may, in fact, think that they're helping them, but in the long run, the correction of those documents can cause them more problems than having erroneous documentation. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to take, obviously, questions later on or to discuss this in more detail.
Maybe I could just zoom in a bit and try to understand what's really then happening to migrants and how they try to get to this process. So, and I think as you have, explained it, and we're also seeing this in many other places, when you have arrived, the legal, or let's say the legal status of the parent would usually have a bearing of the legal status of the rest of the family, whether they have been regularly or irregularly migrated into the country, or that they have been born from these parents who have issues with their documentation. How have you sort of seen this unfolding from the research that you did with Indonesian migrant workers? So how far along are we talking about the impacts that the lack of identity has across generations?
Well, this is an interesting case because it's not people whose citizenship is in question when they get their passport. So in that sense, they're more privileged than the people who are the netizens who are not recognized as citizens per se. But what I've encountered are several people who had been told decades earlier by the Indonesian or the Philippine consulate to just stick with their quote unquote fake or irregular identities and stick with that from now on. But one Indonesian mother, for example, who did that and who married someone in Hong Kong, and had one child who was in Indonesia with the same father and two in Hong Kong, when it came time to getting the child in Indonesia his passport, because she didn't have the earlier documentation, she only had the ASPL documents that the consulate had advised her 20 years ago to keep, 15 or 20 years ago, to be consistent. Otherwise, she'd never be able to be married in Hong Kong. That has created serious problems for the child that was not born in Hong Kong and didn't have the same documentation. So I see that as the afterlives of these contemporary documents. Before this, it wasn't a problem so much. Before the biometrics and the much more intense biosecurity of documents, they could just get a new passport and pay someone for it, and it would resolve those kinds of problems. But the issue was more that young women who want to go and work abroad don't have birth certificates, or they're underage, which then raises the issue of changing rules and laws and norms concerning child labor and child trafficking. And so the local respected people would help them to get the papers they needed to say that they were 18 when maybe they were 15 or 16 or 17 and wanted to go and work abroad. In most cases, in some cases, they were pressured to go abroad. But then each recruitment agency they went through often changed their identities, either their names or their birth dates, just to make them more beholden to the brokerage or the recruitment agency. And so then the women had inconsistent documents. And when the consulate started checking for the with their document comparison computer program, they would discover the same face with two different identities, or they would discover different birth dates associated with the same name. And then even though the Indonesian consulate had talked to the immigration counterparts in Hong Kong about it and thought that they had a kind of G to G agreement, informally and unwritten, when it came down to it, this was not the case. And women who were then being investigated and brought to court, losing their jobs, going deeply into debt, then ended up facing the consequences of this poorly planned change in their documentation. Others were afraid to change their documents in Hong Kong because they'd heard what happened to others. So they would go back to Indonesia and get new documents or get them changed. And then when they would enter Hong Kong, they would be arrested by immigration as well. But as far as the next generation, I think that there are fewer cases in these particular cases. The problems that I've encountered are more with children who were born in Hong Kong and whose mothers have filed claims for asylum or torture claims, which they're not likely to win. But their children then have never lived in their supposed home country, the mother's home country or the father's home country. And that's going to be a bigger issue in terms of documentation.
Thanks, Nicole, for that. And I think you've pointed out to a number of sort of interesting actors and players there in either, facilitating. Sorry, Sangeeta, if you could just keep your microphone muted when we've muted it. Thank you. I mean, just to say that I think that there's a whole host of not just government actors there, but also we are seeing the role that recruitment agencies, I think like you have said, in trying to pave the way for this kind of path towards, getting jobs and securing work, that they can temper or try to come up with a tailor-made solution for migrants in the absence of the right documentation being made available to them. So, and I hope maybe we will come back to you as we cross over then to Neil to understand a little bit more what the UN's work has been. But Nicole, we'll come back to you in sort of trying to unpack each of the different actors maybe, and trying to understand even from your study's point of view, what you think the role each of these actors has to have, whether we're talking about civil society organizations in terms of bringing out this information, in terms of advocating the space for legal identity and documentation, or we're looking at governments. And here I think you've made a point to, you've pointed out to consulates. We're also talking about civil registries that are, and the lack, I guess, of integrated information systems in sending countries for migrants that are away from home and need the right documentation, and therefore kind of just making the situation worse with these sort of not having the right documentation, but continuing to pursue having the wrong documentation crossing over, I guess, across generations. Neil, I wonder if we could have you, as you are unmuting your mic, and yes, very good to see you. I would just quickly introduce you before we ask you a series of some questions that we can hopefully get some clarity on. So Neil McCain is a policy advisor and project manager for the Project Legal Identity under the UN Development Program, UNDP, and he's based in Brussels, and he has been providing a lot of support to country offices that are engaged in supporting national civil registration and national ID schemes, and he's been doing this for approximately 30 years. He's been doing these, approximately 30 have been done over the years. So we're keen to hear, what some of these countries of origin seem like and what his experience has been like. I think also very interesting to hear about some of his background in terms of looking at, whether it's data protection related issues, the use of biometric technologies. We are in the, in the world of innovative technology, how that has either progressed or is giving us excuses not to proceed with providing right documentation, not just to nationals, but also to migrants. And as part of his work, he has been a member of the UN, the EU, as well as OSCE field missions, where they were providing frontline assistance to national electrical authorities in about 40 countries around the world, including my home country, Zambia. So maybe that's why I was very interested to read out that bio. But I think I'm saying all this, Neil, to say that you have quite an extensive experience. So you have obviously seen the impact that migrants have with not having the right documentation in terms of legal identity and not having adequate documentation to facilitate their journeys. And, the Global Compact on Migration was very ambitious, and some say that not ambitious enough. So one of the first things critics that come out is that it focuses too much on nationals and away from migrants in terms of trying to empower migrants with the right documentation that basically opens doors for them. So I was just wondering, could you just maybe take us through and tell us about, the UN legal identity agenda, and what is that? What is this project all about? And in unfolding it, maybe how does it really live up to the expectations of the obligations that are there for states, towards migrants under international human rights law? Over to you, Neil.
Thanks a lot, Paddy. Thanks a lot to everybody. It's a real honor to be here. Paddy, what I'm going to try and do is just whirlwind tour through the general issues or the general debates around legal identity globally at the moment, and then focus on migrant specific issues. What is the Legal Identity Agenda Task Force of the UN? Well, in 2018, the Secretary General of the UN asked the Deputy Secretary General to get the UN system together to come up with a broad approach to the whole issue of registration and legal identity. A lot of that impetus came from the issue of statelessness, and in particular the Rohingya crisis at the time, where it was realized by a lot of member states, a huge problem here for a lot of stateless people, and indeed, of course, a lot of migrants then in vulnerable situations, is that they can end up in a situation where they have absolutely no means to prove who they are and to identify themselves. And we realized that as a system, the UN was simply not working together on this issue. To give a very blunt example, therefore, UNICEF care about birth registration. Their mandate is children. So they don't really care about adults that might have no means to identify themselves. In UNDP, we had been supporting a lot of countries with elections, registering people to vote. So in other words, we were only interested in adults and not at all interested in children. So on that issue alone, then, UNICEF and UNDP absolutely not talking to each other. Now, when you look at the SDG target 16.9 on this issue, which promises legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030, it asks a very obvious question then. Can you have legal identity without birth registration? If you're in a very, very lucky and privileged position, your birth is registered, a birth certificate is issued, usually to your mother, and then you build an identity tree as you go forward in life, oftentimes with the birth certificate as the basis for that. So you can get a driving license maybe later on, perhaps a national ID card, eventually a passport, but all largely based on your birth certificate. Well, obviously in recent years, there have been a number of countries that have realized and accepted. Millions of our citizens either never had their birth registered, they never received a birth certificate, or for whatever reason, they find themselves as adults without any means to identify themselves. So those countries have started rolling out various forms of national ID card systems, or in the case of the most well-known scheme in India, the Aadhaar system, where they literally register everybody, take biometric data, issue a national ID number or an Aadhaar number in that case, and whatever about then the situation with the birth registration in that country, at least those people are now in the system, they exist, they're registered, they are legally identifiable. When a number of countries started to roll out these schemes over the last few years, We noticed that in some cases, unfortunately, that meant less and less money going towards the birth registration system, and indeed, very, very importantly, the death registration system. So if you have, therefore, a well-functioning, well-financed national ID system, whether that involves the issuance of a national ID card or not, and then you have an under-reporting or an under-functioning civil registration system of births and deaths, that leads to two very obvious problems. How do you identify teenagers that are entering an adult national ID system? If they turn up at the age of 16 or 18, how do we identify them if they don't have a birth certificate? That's one problem. And secondly, at the other end of the life cycle, when people die, if there is no functioning death registration system, how do you remove those people from a national ID card or a national ID database? As a result, therefore, the UN came together following this 2018 decision of the Secretary General in this Legal Identity Agenda Task Force, where we are trying to support member states build a holistic birth to death system of civil registration, identity management, and indeed also then vital statistics that allow countries to make demographic planning, public administration planning, socio-economic planning on the basis of solid population data. We therefore don't necessarily favor the idea that a country will say, forget the children. Children will grow up and we'll worry about them then. Let's just get all the adults registered now. We absolutely see the temptation in that approach, but we worry that that leads to problems down the line then if you're not financing the death and birth and death registration system at the same time. So that's one of the main challenges at the moment, and that's a lot of that work we're trying to do in a number of countries, like you mentioned. But specifically on the issue of migrants and how to assist vulnerable migrants, in particular migrants that for whatever reason now find themselves in a foreign country unable to identify themselves. And this is obviously the case of people that have either been trafficked either for sex trafficking purposes or indeed vulnerable migrants who have taken employment in a foreign country and then had their passport seized by employers, and they find themselves now very, very vulnerable with no ability to identify themselves and potentially in political difficulties, not only legal difficulties, where a host community says, who are these illegal immigrants? They don't have any papers and blah, blah, blah. If you notice, bizarrely, every single member state of the UN, 193, have actually come together over the years and have agreed technical standards around passports that are set by the International Civil Aviation Organization, where everybody, be it an Irish passport or a Zambian passport or whatever, all the countries have agreed what those technical standards should be and what exactly should be included in a passport. And therefore, those passports are now recognized by every other country in the world. Such a system does not exist for birth certificates, or in particular for any form of national ID card system. So we very much favor in the UN then this idea that countries could come together and agree on technical standards for national ID cards, or indeed any other form of identity document below a passport that would allow any migrant, if they had that document, to also be identified, or for a host government to identify that person on the basis of that national ID card. At the moment, there's very, very few countries that will identify and accept the valid identity of somebody on the basis of a national ID, even if that person has either lost their passport or had their passport stolen. The other point I would say, and that is, I think, very, very important, what we would like to see in the years to come, we don't see any reason why countries couldn't also come together and agree on standards for digital copies of either passports or indeed national ID schemes. Wouldn't it be wonderful, for example, if a migrant found themselves in a very vulnerable situation, they've either been trafficked or being exploited by employers, etc. They do not have a passport, they do not feel like they can go to the host police force, they may not have consular representation in that country. Wouldn't it be excellent if they were able to somehow download a digital version of a passport or a digital version of a national ID and have that recognized by the host country so that at least the identity of that person is no longer in question. We don't see any reasons from a policy point of view why countries would object to that type of scheme. But obviously there's major operational, financial, logistical, and technical reasons why that has not been agreed to up until now. And that's where I think organizations like the UN and the World Bank can support member states to also develop digital versions of identity credentials that then could be agreed at the international level. The final point I will make, Paddy, with regards to refugees and stateless persons indeed, there are many, many millions of people finding themselves in foreign countries that have sought refuge due to conflict, due to natural disaster or whatever. And a lot of those people have no identity documents at all for various reasons. And all of the member states of the UN have agreed under the UN Refugee Convention that they will recognize identity credentials issued by the UN itself, specifically issued by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency. So member states will recognize an identity credential issued by the UN. But ultimately, we do think across the UN system that one of the goals eventually should be that a host country should at least allow any refugee, displaced person, stateless person be registered in the host country's civil registration system or national ID system without necessarily having to address the issue of citizenship, because this is what is preventing, or this is why a lot of countries are very reluctant to register people that they consider to be foreigners, where, you know, stateless people whose nationality, where they have no nationality at all, where there's a fight between countries, neighboring countries as to whose people they are, etc. It should be the case that any host country would agree to at least register them people in the civil register national ID and issue them with an identity document without necessarily having to confer or address the issue of citizenship at that time. I think I should probably stop here because I'm sure there will be some questions later.
Yes, there's a lot of I think enlightenment that's coming out of the chat room, and I think you know, also just reflections on how your presentation has been very excellent in terms of trying to understand the rationale behind a legal identity at that level of the UN and kind of bringing it in. I was going to ask you probably as a sort of a follow-on question, if I'm sitting in a Ministry of Integration or Ministry of Home Affairs in Zambia, or in Sierra Leone, Liberia, could be anywhere in Asia as well, or in any part of the world. What's the vision sort of operationalizing this? I mean, you've talked about the political considerations maybe not being, I mean, that no political arguments would be against it because it sort of should facilitate life for migrants. And I think there could be maybe a few arguments that could be placed on that in terms of looking at, you know, the fact that some countries have felt it comfortable, let's call it comfortable, not acceptable, that you have a group of migrants that are actually stateless, because then you have an industry that's kind of around that. It helps to service an existing industry in a particular country. So there hasn't been a very big push, I think, coming from the state itself, because there are more private sector interests in sort of having an imperfect situation where you have some migrants that have access to legal identity and some others that don't. I mean, the case here is that you're just able to get cheaper labor, for instance, because it's people who are undocumented, they don't have any legal status, and therefore you can pay them under the table. And you could also basically go into any form, you know, any of the worst forms of modern slavery and forced labor. So that the forces that be in these particular industries would be would call a bigger voice, right? And push, maybe not push governments, but sort of leave governments that are feeling that they have to take on this move, not to move so proactively. So maybe that's just one thing to think about, and if you can reflect on it. But then coming back to my question on how do you sort of see this being operationalized? So currently, as a Zambian, we get our national identity at 16. You've got to prove it with your father, not your mother, a relative of your father. because you're a child of a man. And his documentation, regardless of whether he has been present in your life or not, remains essentially important. So you look for a relative from your father's side of the family who takes you to this national registration card office, and they take photocopies of his village, because your village is assigned to his village. And that already, I think, has some issues in it. Now, when you are, as in the Zambian, I think terminology, they're calling it an alien, meaning that you don't get a national identity card. So you are not of, you're not born. It's not a citizenship, or it's not a right by birth. You are given a different type of ID. That has already caused a lot of different problems, I think, for migrants, as it can cause for a young man who is Zambian and has had no connection to his father. So I'm just giving you sort of these comparators to say, how do we really see, on top of all this, having a UN ID that says, forget all this? So are we scraping all these? How are we moving towards the operationalization at a very local level?
I mean, Paddy, those are wonderful examples that you've given there. We would, well, I can't say we would love to be in a situation where we could sort of, impose changes to national laws upon countries, but we can't. All we can do is ultimately advise countries on what would be the best approach. Within the UN system, if UNDP, and that's basically people like me that are civilian hired staff, and UNICEF and UNHCR and the World Food Programme, if we all come together and agree on a lovely policy document, that's fine. But at the end of the day, that just means UN agencies are agreeing. It's member states have to get together to agree within the member state organs of the UN. And within the UN, then, it is what's called the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, that is the body of the UN that sets the standards for birth registration, death registration, and increasingly now for national ID schemes. But unfortunately, given that you are trying to get 193 countries to agree on these things, sometimes it means that there's actually very, very little said really at the real technical level of what identity documents and civil registers, etc., should look like. The agencies, of course, can go into more detail. So, for example, in UNICEF advise, and we absolutely agree, you have to empower women to have the right to register their child's birth without the need for any permission or any signatures from any male relatives. We believe that that is highly necessary to empower women as not just human beings in their own right, but as political actors as well. We absolutely do not agree with the 25 member states that still do not allow a woman to pass nationality onto her child. We think it's terrible that some of these countries still say no, only a father can pass nationality onto the child, which results in people, I can think of one member state I won't name, but you could be born in that country in 1949 to a mother from that country, and you are still alive today, 72 years old, considered a foreigner because your father came from another country. That's wrong. What we can do, and all we can do, is look to areas of the world, and I think here the Europeans have done a good job on this issue of where they have come together in the Schengen zone to at least say, look, let's standardize all of these national ID cards so that we will recognize each other's national ID cards as travel documents, meaning you can travel now from France to Germany just with a French ID card or a German ID card, and you don't need a passport. So we've just worked with the International Organization for Migration to publish a document to establish free movement zones that will allow other regional economic communities, whether that's CARICOM, SADC, ASEAN, countries that come together economically in a region, to advise them, look, here is a way where you could come together as 10 countries, 5 countries, 15 countries, or whatever, to set standards around national IDs that would allow you to recognize each other's IDs, and in particular in a way then that might allow for visa-free travel, or travel without the necessity of having passports, which, as you know, can also be quite expensive for a lot of people. And in particular, when you need to replace one, if you have it lost or stolen or whatever, passports can cost $150, $200 in a lot of countries, which is just not feasible for a lot of vulnerable and low-paid migrants. So this issue about standardizing national ID or documents below passports, we think is very, very important. I know I've been rambling a bit. I should probably stop again now.
No, that's okay. We will be coming back to you, and I think it's this is the essence of it, is to try and dig a bit deeper into what an objective is and what it looks like practically, right? And I think that there are some other, I think you've mentioned the EU zone and the national ID card system, and then there are other spaces that we see, for instance, a one passport, but this is to facilitate travel as well. And you see it in the East African Community Zone as well, where they're trying to sort of look at this as one package, a common market, but also allowing that free movement of persons, and now almost going to, an East African passport, right? Not just standardizing practices, but even going for one type of a passport and IDs, and somehow again also bringing in the issue of identity cards. I mean, I recall living in Tanzania and having a driver's license that we used to call a SADC driver's license, only to find out that it was just a name that we gave to it, because actually when you drove around in SADC, it was not very well accepted. It was looked at as a Zambian driving license. So I think in a lot of ways, I'm just trying to question here, how then does the, that kind of, so where is the movement? Is the movement really coming then from the local side? So we're talking about national registries, we're talking about birth registries, we're talking about offices that are responsible for providing. So we're not are we looking at parallel structures when we talk about identity cards for migrants, or are we talking about the very structures so that we can synchronize all the different information and they can be able to speak to each other? So different systems are speaking to each other. And here I'm thinking about migrants arriving in countries where you find that the parents have not had any identity, or maybe they have had, and that means that the children born in that particular space lack then the access to education, because it's the number that, your identity number, your ID card, or your birth certificate gives you access and opens doors to the hospital, to the school, and also for you to get social protection, also for you, for instance, to get any kind of service from a municipality. So I wanted to come in again and maybe also back again to Nicole, if you can, in sort of talking about what you have seen as the ways in which we're bringing in, who are the actors that we need to have on the table for a UN legal identity system to actually work and benefit the migrant in their daily living. So I'll start with you, Aniel, and then I will go to Nicole.
Thanks a lot, Paddy. One thing I bet that many of the participants today will be surprised to hear that in the United States, there are 57 different birth certificates. They have 57 different jurisdictions for issuing civil registration documents. So bizarrely, a birth certificate in Texas looks nothing like a birth certificate in California or in New York, right? And as a result then, up until very, very recently, I mean, throughout the 80s and the 90s, and indeed past 2000 to 2010, somebody from New York turning up in California with the birth certificate, the Californians would have to get on the telephone to New York and say, is this a real certificate? Was this really issued by you to this person way back? Now they've digitized it in the last couple of years, but there's an example, I think, throughout parts of Africa, throughout parts of the Middle East, whatever, countries should come together and agree technical standards around birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, etc., that would allow each other to accept those documents without having to verify them through some cumbersome telephone or written procedure with the country that has issued those documents. Again, organizations like International Organization on Migration can help a lot with that, or indeed the Civil Aviation Organization that has done that exact task for passports. When you talk about who should be in the room, I absolutely think women's groups need to be in the room, civil society advocates, people that speak minority languages and who represent migrants speaking minority languages. It's not very useful, quite frankly, to some migrants if they're issued with a document by a host country that's in a language they simply do not read, or in an alphabet they don't understand. They don't even know what this document says. So again, I think standardizing these documents at the international level, including digital versions that will allow the migrants themselves to feel confident that this document that they have received from a host country is a legitimate document that shows what their rights are. Again, it's pointless if you receive a document, a written paper document from a host country that might say something like, you are legal here in this country for the next 30 days, but you think you're legal for the next 90 days, and then you find out you're illegal after 40 days, etc. That's not good, you know. So being able to issue documents in a standardized international format that migrants themselves will feel confident about, we think is very, very important. I know I'm speaking, one point I want to make before handing over to Nicole. Nicole, I'm sorry. There's one very, very important issue, I think, that's coming down the line, and I think countries are going to have to accept this is an issue they will have to discuss soon. I have no doubt that in coming years, certain countries are going to say, okay then, we might make visa issuance easier for citizens of your state that want to come here and live here, or we might accept documents other than passports as a means to legally acknowledge the identity of this person. But in order to do so, we want direct access to your database from our country. And that presents a huge sovereignty issue for a lot of countries that they do not want to give up. And I know, for example, UNHCR, the refugee agency, they face this issue all the time, where countries are coming to them saying, we believe that there are a couple of people of interest to us from a national security point of view that are registered refugees in your refugee camp here in our country, and we want access to your database so that we can check biometric data, etc. And that presents a huge, huge challenge for UNHCR, because then they have to tell that host country, I'm sorry, you don't have the right to access our database. But it is possible, conceivably, that countries in good relations with each other could agree to give each other access on a limited basis to each other's core national ID databases, or indeed core civil registers, to allow the host country to verify for their own satisfaction, the birth registration records, for example, of migrants that want to come and live in the host country. I do see that as possible if countries are in good friendly relations and they want to enhance further cross-border movement of trade and people. For countries not in good relations, however, this is a bigger challenge. I'll shut up at this point.
No, please don't. I think it's very interesting to hear all these reflections, because I think, you know, as much as in a lot of ways we've heard that COVID has disrupted a lot of the progress that has been made towards, you know, implementation of, you know, priority plans that were made at national level for the Global Compact for Migration. I think what we also need to realize is that there's a lot of baggage pre-COVID that we carry with us, and a lot of things then we can say that COVID is helping us to pay a closer attention to it and begin to deal with them in terms of information sharing. You know, what kind of space does that involve? But then I think also the intention to provide these, you know, migrants with the legal documentation and understanding what that has meant, even in the space of handling a pandemic at national levels. Nicole, I wondered if I could just bring you back and get your reflections. I think, firstly, maybe, you know, starting backwards with just the question that we have talked about with Neil here, some reactions to that, and the question that we had raised with you in terms of trying to understand who's really sitting at the table and where we should be looking in terms of trying to forge forward a little bit faster. Nicole?
Yeah, so my role here is probably devil's advocate more than anything, because as an ethnographer and someone who does face-to-face research with people on the ground, migrant workers on the ground, migrant mothers on the ground, people who have who are undocumented or who are asylum seekers, I think they should be at the table. They need to be at the table because they're the ones who understand most how they have been exploited by people who should be at the table, including the brokers who make so much money off of them and who benefit from recruiting them using authentic documents which may or may not have accurate data on them. So they facilitate the getting the documents they need to migrate or to have some degree of mobility or identification. But fundamentally, there are huge problems in terms of operationalizing. And I'm not talking about just Indonesia, because certainly there were a lot of well-meaning officials who bought into and agreed to the importance of the GCM objective. But what happens in practice is that the whole migration infrastructure that includes small-scale local recruiters, as well as more urban, large recruitment agencies for migrant work, are also intertwined with the interests of government. A lot of the government representatives make profits off of those migration industries and have family members and relatives who run them or who are invested in them. And so it isn't in their best interest to correct people's identities. In fact, I'd been told a number of times, well, a few going to prison, that's a small cost to pay for getting the other documents to be accurate. But the fact of the matter is that other documents were never, as many as a third or more of the documents were not accurate, but they didn't appear in the master database. So the master database that's supposed to be telling you, okay, this is their national biometric ID, most of them didn't have them because they were too old already to have had them. And so they might have had paper IDs, but they got a different one in every sort of region that they lived in. So you could get a whole different ID in every sort of province or region of Indonesia that you had lived in or worked with during your life. So some showed me or told me about multiple identities that they had in different regions or multiple times that they were registered. So in terms of what's needed for this to work, I think that what Neil raises in terms of the birth registration is critically important. But the further question is, how do you do that when people are registering in small towns that barely have computers or that don't connect to the national database? So then, it's wonderful. They're registering more and more of these, missing millions is what they call them in Indonesia, and they're getting birth certificates. But those birth certificates aren't always accurate anyway, because people are afraid of, either the parents are not married or they're not married in the official way. And so they're afraid of going in and reporting it. I knew some single parents who, single mothers in Hong Kong, who brought their children home and then managed to get new birth certificates from hospitals for the child, pretending the child was actually a sibling, so that the parents became the parents of that child, so that they would get the local benefits, and they have good ID, and it worked. So this is, completely corrupt from a, sort of objective UN high up macro perspective, but it works for people for now. So at the table, if it was an ideal world, you would have multiple government offices, multiple recruitment agencies, and multiple NGOs, as well as the migrant workers, the mothers, the women's groups as well. In Hong Kong, it so happened that the migrant workers were the ones who brought this problem to the fore and communicated with the Indonesian president, as well as local Indonesian lawyers and supporters of their different organizations. They understood the system better than anyone did in terms of the risks and the actions that were taking place as a result.
I think somebody, please carry on.
Okay, but that's mostly what I have to say is that the verification systems would need to come a long way in many countries and be connected more. And I think the example of the birth certificates in the US is a perfect example. They're so easily faked, they're so easily reproduced. And if, the US is no great example of a lot of things these days, but if you consider all these countries trying to have a computerized system with these IDs in it, starting with birth certificates, the challenge is and the problem of corruption and of conflicting interests when it comes down to the money side of it. Many countries have had all kinds of problems of corruption getting the biometric identifications going, including Indonesia. And so I'm just, both I admire what Neil is saying is being proposed, and my mind is boggled by the idea of how you would impose this kind of, how you would get the buy-in from countries. And it's easy for them to say, we buy into it, we'll do it. But that's where the problems come in, is that they say they'll do it, they like the idea, but then there are high up conflicting economic interests that get in the way. And that would be the part that I would be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Neil, shall I give you a moment to, I see you nodding your head, shall I give you a moment to react on that one?
Thanks, Paddy. Thanks to Nicole as well. I mean, unfortunately, there's a couple more complicating issues as well to the ones Nicole already identified. I mean, there's a theory, particularly among a lot of privacy advocates, and indeed you find some support for this idea within other parts of the international development community as well, that it's not necessarily a good thing that a person has one identity, passport, national ID, driving license, birth certificate, that they all have the same name, that person is identifiable from passport all the way back to birth. Because by centralizing identity data in one place, and in particular if it's digitized, then this creates somehow what they call a single point of failure. If hackers hack the system, then they've hacked everything about you. Or indeed, if it is the government itself that is acting in an autocratic manner, conducting surveillance on its population, abusing human rights, by having all of the identity data in one place, it makes it easier for those types of governments to do that. And so a lot of privacy advocates actually think it is a good idea. If I am registered as Niall McCann in the social security system, Niall Joseph McCann in the tax system, Niall Joseph Harold McCann in the social security system, and that those systems actually don't know that it's the same person. They actually think that is good because it means if one of those identities gets hacked, at least the others don't get hacked, and that you aren't destroying a person's entire identity in by one breach of the system. A problem with that, I find, and we find, is that telling governments that it's a good idea to operate 5 or 10 or 20 different databases of the population, potentially with slightly differing identities, Niall in one, Niall J in another, Niall JH in the third one. It's completely financially unsustainable. It means costs so much more money to operate all of those systems individually. But of course, by telling countries that they should come together as one to have kind of one core identity database, it does mean then, in effect, telling government ministries, government agencies, somehow you have to give up some of the power that you have by operating your own database. And now you have to work together with other ministries, which could be from other political parties or whatever, you don't like each other. And so getting countries to have one common vision of what all of this should mean and what it should look like as the perfect national system is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, that can mean then countries might say, look, we can only accept a passport because if we agree to accept a national ID card as evidence of a migrant's identity, it's possible that that national ID card might have a different identity than the one that's on the migrant's passport, and that isn't acceptable for us because we don't know then, it sounds like identity fraud, etc., etc. Unfortunately, there isn't really any common international centralized, standardized policy on this issue. There's various different perspectives on this one. at the moment. But of course, we also know as well, many people in the world, not that many, I don't know what percent, have double nationalities, might have two passports, and they might have two different names on those passports. And there's nothing wrong with that. That could be a woman, for example, that got married and took her husband's name and didn't change that name on one passport, but did on the other passport. In effect, she has two identities now and can travel with two different passports, enter a country with one passport, exit the country with the other passport with a different identity, you know? So these kind of things happen out there. So I do think it is possible for countries to get together and at least agree on the standardization of the identity documents in a manner that will allow governments recognize those identities and help vulnerable migrants that might have lost their passport, had their passport stolen, et cetera, et cetera.
No, thank you for those reflections. I don't know, Nicole, if you wanted to come in again, maybe even as I give you a minute to come in again. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that, you know, there's a huge literature on the history of identity documents and passports, and much of it is based on excluding people and keeping them out rather than helping them have fair mobility. So that, you know, the history of visas and passports in Canada had to do with keeping South Asians, especially South Asian men, out of there and maintaining it as a white settler colony. And so a lot of the ideas behind this regularization and surveillance through biometric documentation is about closed borders. It's not about open borders. It's about identifying people who you don't want, which is, you know, it takes away what I have seen as some of the creative uses of documents that help the people on the bottom. For example, in the old days, when people were, before all that biometric stuff, I knew a number of cases of migrant workers who would go and work in Japan, and they were only allowed to stay for a very short time, but people would then basically come in with their passport and visa and sell it to someone else, and then use someone else's who had recently come in and who was about to expire to leave themselves later on. And it was a way to get around the highly restrictive sort of situations in which they were allowed to work, but only for very, very short periods of time, and then could use it to their benefit. They can't do that anymore. And what I would think at the very, very least is that as these kinds of systems go in, they would have to have huge, long periods of time of grace periods where people could get their identifications corrected with no risk of being punished for it or put in prison for having multiple identities or that sort of thing. But I do agree with some of the concerns about having regular identities and national databases of those identities and the potential harmful use of those narrow sort of routes of mobility and of the inequalities of mobility in any case, with very different types of passports that give different privileges to different types of people, which I think is problematic. You know, the move among the Indonesians to no longer have the 3-year migrant worker passports and now to give them regular 5-year standard passports is a really important move, because it makes them less likely to become targets when they come and go, especially when they come back home, of people who are trying to get money from migrant workers. So some of those improvements, I think, can be very positive, but others are very worrisome to many countries, including the UK, that hasn't wanted national identity cards.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Nicole and Neil. And our chat room is burning with a lot of different questions, so we will cross over in a moment. And I see hands, so participants, feel free to just raise your hands. Remember just to be prompt and give your question within a minute and a half or so that we can get those going. And as hands are coming up, I think I'm just reflecting a bit on, you know, both your interventions in terms of how we really need to go back again and look at the basis. and look at what is already provided then at the national level. And that's the place where you need to start that change. And that's where operationally, I think there are still a lot of difficulties that migrants would need to face, because they're facing the same, let's say, inadequate systems, for lack of another way to put it, that should provide this kind of ID that gives them access to different kinds of services in the place that they've temporarily or permanently are calling home. So I will start, I saw Mr. Kumar. Kumar, do you want to go first? And then after that, I will have Mr. Bese and Justin after, and Eugene. Kumar, the floor is yours. Mr. Bese, the floor is yours.
All right. My name is Mr. Basi. First of all, I say thank you.
You're on mute now.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Can you hear me? Good. First of all, I say thank you to Nell and Nicole. You are doing a great job. Sometimes sourcing information for migrants are always a very big challenge. It's a uphill task, whereby you want to dig out the right information that will make a man that is moving from country A to country B to have a safe cell. And it's very hard for you to come by those information that will guarantee the safe stay. How strong is the marketing team of GCM and the information disseminating center in putting up information that one can come out with formidable information, having heard what we have heard today, strange. Some people do it to close the door against you. How strong are we doing on that?
Okay, Jiban Kumar, go ahead. Okay, Justin, go ahead. Okay, Kumar, the floor is yours. Jiban, please go ahead. Okay, let's try Eugene. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. If you could just tune up the volume just a little bit more.
Okay. Okay, is it better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Nicole. Neil, you've got a lot of perspective about this, and I'm so enthused about your dimension. Now, for instance, let's say my birth set that I was given when I was born, when I tender age is not going to vote anymore because you transform to what we call the biometrics. And sometimes some people at the countryside find it difficult having access to this biometrics, and it becomes a general problem for them. Thank you.
I heard, if you could just repeat your question, I heard your references to biometric access to people in rural areas. Is that the implication?
Yeah, basically somebody at the countryside might not have access to that biometric kind of registration. So sometimes if you come to the city, you want to access some facility, it's likely to tender in the old birth set that you were born with that does not hold anymore because it migrated to another form of birth set. But he or she is not aware and creates a lot of problems for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Justin? Justin, we can't hear you. Maybe you want to check your microphone? We still cannot hear you. I see you are, oh, now you're muted. You're unmuted, but we cannot hear you. We have no audio. So maybe a Bluetooth connection or something, just check it. Otherwise we cannot hear you. And in the meantime, I think we've got also some other questions that came up in the chat that we could also have a look at. I think there was Joanne Gloria. Joanne Gloria, are you in the room? Would you like to share your question? Otherwise, as it's standing here, you are asking about what the migration stakeholders are doing in terms of policies to address challenges that are related to acquisition of legal documentation, identification for migrants in destination countries. So I guess here this would be a question that's either related. I mean, migration stakeholders, we're talking consulars, but we're also talking all those who are facilitating, I think, migrants' journeys. Otherwise, Justin, we still.
I think we lost Paddy, colleagues. I think our connection went down.
I think just we have to wait for a few minutes. She'll be back.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, as they say, it's not a Zoom day if you haven't been disrupted by power. I saw in the chat room others have thunderstorms, and we have the smell of the rain and something coming. So the power just shut down on us. But thank God for 4G. So here we are. Okay, I think Justin, were we able to hear you? I think Justin, we still have a problem with your audio. It's like we can see you, but it doesn't work. Okay. Oh, we have, actually, I've just realized that Nana has joined us. So maybe Nana, could we have you just share with us your reflections? I mean, we have just been diving really into the objective itself and trying to understand what states committed to, in 2018 when they signed up to the Global Compact for Migration on this particular objective. And, Nicole and Anil, from sort of very different perspectives, if you like, have tried to unpack for us what that has meant in their worlds. On one side, looking at this, the possibility of a United Nations legal identity, and there's an agenda around that. And then Nicole really breaking down for us what the lack of legal identity has meant for Indonesian migrant workers. And I think it would be great to hear from you, from your perspective, from the Americas, trying to understand your work at BAJI, which is the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. So I'm also trying to do an introduction of Nana as I go along, asking you a question. So Nana is the Executive Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and it's the largest Black-led racial justice and immigrant rights organizations in the United States. And for the past 25 years, she has been a movement attorney with various roles, such as the co-founder of the Justice Warriors for Black Lives and Human Rights Advocacy, and as well as being a former professor in Pan-African Studies Department at the California State University in Los Angeles. And she's also a graduate of Cornell University, and she's the current president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. Now, Nana, maybe you can just kind of, speak to us about some of your work at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and, very briefly also just making linkages between the work that you have, in advocacy efforts together with other partners in trying to support the cause for migrants to have legal identity and documentation. So sorry to put you on the spot, but just, diving you through straight to the main course, because we're still on it.
No, thank you so very much. Appreciate you, Patty. Appreciate you. Appreciate everyone here. And I'll talk quickly because I know there's a lot of folks still have questions, but Part of the work that we do, obviously we educate, we advocate, we organize on behalf of Black migrants. And I'm sure so many of you are hearing here in the United States, this big push that people are making for green cards and for, citizenship and all of these legal statuses, quote unquote. But what people are not talking enough about is the issue of getting identification, the issue of getting the pieces that you need to be able to have your identification to work and to do, to get your driver's license if you're able to do that in one of the states here. And that process has become so slow as to create issues that are disrupting people's lives. So obviously we had, before the pandemic, with the Trump administration, not much effort and money put into this process, right? Because that wasn't helpful to them. And then we had the pandemic, which really had an effect because all of USCIS out here, what the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, shut down. And I've heard people, as I was on, talking about biometrics and the difficulty in terms of getting biometrics, et cetera. And of course, all of that really shut down here with the pandemic. The issue, much of the issue in getting identification then came up because the United States in particular has so many barriers. Like there's a lot of hoops that they have you go through and pieces of identification that they want you to get, some of which is easier for folks to get than others. And particularly when we're talking about Black migrants, folks from the continent, in places where there's conflict or where there was conflict, the capacity to get the identification they're requiring of you in order to get identification is often really difficult. And so we see that in the one area where people have actually been able to get a pathway to citizenship, it's been very difficult for people to get what it is that they need because of the requirements. And that's with LaRif, with Liberian, who came to the United States during the Liberian War. You can imagine how long ago that was, but you have a new way for people to get identification or get citizenship, which happened last year, and then they need the identification that goes with that. And because the process has been so slow, people are finding themselves caught in a space in which they're not able to have the piece of paper, the card with the picture that they need in order to be able to prove that in fact this is happening. And because fraud, the criminalization of Blackness means that there's always this, assumption that there's something fraudulent going on. And so when you're not able to get identification in time, based upon different deadlines to be able to show for work or to be able to show for your driver's license, et cetera, that obviously impacts your life. And it's very difficult to slide by in ways that, as we talk to folks in particular, there's various groups of white migrants who are actually calling themselves migrants in America and not expats. One of the things they talk about is how much easier it is for them to navigate even without that identification in a way that Black folks, brown folks, indigenous migrants, Asian migrants that are here are not able to do that. So it is an issue that, because of the criminalization, Blackness adds another ping to the problems with respect to not having identification, and the slowdown in getting identification together and out by USCIS and other entities within the immigration system has made the situation really, really difficult. So I'll stop there just because I don't want to take up all the time, but if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hello. Hi, sorry, I think I lapsed out a bit. I think I was also just thinking about, so what does it really look like on the ground? So the lack of identity, like you have said, hasn't actually stopped people from still being able to, is the lack of having legal documentation as well as having a legal identity and being recognized as migrants in whichever capacity hasn't really stopped people navigating different systems. And I'm also thinking about kind of some of the work that you have done with other partners, and I'm trying to reflect a bit back at I think you've done some work not too long ago with other partners where you were trying to sort of look away from the legal identity and still be able to provide for migrants. So we're talking Haitian migrants here, and that kind of work that goes behind not just advocacy, but also providing services. And here, what am I trying to bring across? I'm sort of trying to bring across the way civil society manages then to operate with a group of migrants, with groups of migrants who don't have this legal identity, who don't have what a government requires you to show, that piece of paper, that card, or in a digital way, or whichever way that is able to identify you, to give you access. So how is it that civil society has been able to kind of, almost jump into the future of what a government should be doing, right? So I'm trying to bring that a bit into focus and saying, why are we not running at the same pace that we see civil society running in terms of government?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is what ends up happening, is that we end up having to fill the gap. And so we talk about it in in several contexts, one of the contexts being mutual aid, really seeing how can we provide some of those services. It's not easy. And, there's a whole group of civil society that is trying to make this effort. I'll speak specifically of what you're talking about with respect to the border, in which we find Haitian and other Black asylum seekers. And when people think of those images and what happened at Del Rio, 60% of those folks were Haitian, of those asylum seekers. 40% were Black asylum seekers from other countries, the Congo, Cameroon, Angola, Mauritania, some of the places in the Caribbean, et cetera. And so what some of what us and our partners and others are doing is actually really providing services, help and providing food, providing referrals in terms of clothing, providing places for people to live. I mean, some of the work that Baji has done and others have done is actually literally looking for short-term housing, and so that people can get on to their loved ones, because they, and try to see if community can help in some kinds of ways. So there's some actual direct services pieces that have happened, but there actually has also been some advocacy that civil society has made to push back against some of these illegal identity requirements, right? To say, hey, we know that there are people that have worked, and that these people that have worked are undocumented, and now you're giving money out to people who were workers, right, and excluded workers, meaning workers that were excluded from relief that the state or federal government had because they didn't have this legal identity. But these people work, so we're going to require you to not only make sure that you get monies to them, but that you don't have the same identification requirements in order for them to get that money. And that has happened in California, where I live. That has happened in New York. That has happened, in some of the other places in the North and the Midwest. That has not happened so much in the South, unfortunately, but we are still making that push, and in some parts of the Midwest as well, to see how that can happen. But it's only happened because civil society has spoken up, because the government, if it cannot give people money, is happy, So it's really been the work of civil society to say that we'll provide, but obviously we can't provide for millions and millions of people. And so we're going to require you to do more than you're doing right now. With respect to people, making sure that people are supported and assisted in spite of the fact that they don't have legal identity or legal identification.
Thanks, Nana, for that. Neil and Nicole, I wonder if I could, ask you, and also Nana, maybe at the, after Neil and Nicole have responded, any reflections you would sort of like to share around the questions that were asked, some of the questions, if you managed to have a look in the chat, and also kind of your reflections on this.
Nicole.
Nicole, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I couldn't hear all the questions very well, But I did want to comment on one of the things that Nana said that I thought was really important, which is that the tension between centralizing, which we were talking about before, versus the decentralization of being able to, like in California, create internal policies that get around the roadblocks put up at the federal level or even at the state level, where you've got more regional responses by civil society. And I think that that's critically important. I find that the centralized ideas, much like the centralization of universities in the US right now, often creates a lot more problems in the short run, at least. And that the smaller civil society-led or local government-led solutions are often more helpful in the short run to minorities and migrant workers and undocumented people. And so I do want to, sort of give a cheer to the local, smaller scale sort of activism that goes on that really understands what people are going through. I found the same thing in Hong Kong with a lot of the NGOs, the volunteer lawyers, and the activist domestic workers themselves were the ones who were the biggest experts, the ones who knew what would help them, what could help sort of correct the higher policy from above that was causing them damage, and how to rethink it so that it worked for them and their interests. So sorry, that's a little long-winded, but I just wanted to say that.
No, that's, thank you for sharing that, Neil.
Can I mention a bit about biometrics, Paddy, because Mr. Eugene asked that question earlier, and I think it's a very, very important point. First of all, at the global international level, there is a shocking lack of any kind of standards or policy guidance around the use of biometric technology. Very, very little. In fact, the only UN document that talks about the use of biometrics is in the counterterrorism context, where the Security Council passed a resolution in 2016 that mandates countries to establish biometric systems in order to catch terrorists, and mandates those countries to share this biometric data across borders for the purposes of counterterrorism. And of course, with a lot of documents you hear about in the counterterrorism context, the term terrorism is not defined at all. There's no document that the UN has ever approved that defines what is a terrorist. The one thing they can agree on is what is an act of terrorism. If somebody gets on a bus and blows up the bus and everybody dies, everyone will agree that is an act of terrorism. But you want to talk about what is or who is a terrorist, you are never going to get 193 countries together to agree on that. And I don't like the idea, and I don't think anybody on this call should like the idea, that somehow biometric data, facial recognition data, is passing from country to country at the request of countries so that they can identify terrorists. Because of course, one country might say, well, I want all of this data on these people. We think they're terrorists. And another country by going, we don't necessarily think they're terrorists. So it's an example of where you need much more well-developed standards and principles around the use of biometric technology. And as you all know, biometric technology has been invented by people that look an awful lot like me, kind of for people that look an awful lot like me, and it's well documented now, the failures of non-white people to be processed correctly by biometric systems, in particular facial recognition systems. And we are all aware, it's not just in the US, a number of cases where people, non-white people, have been convicted on the basis of facial recognition identification that turned out to be false. They weren't even that person that they were convicted of being. So you cannot impose and casually roll out systems of biometric identification across populations when you only have foreign, largely white technology companies involved in designing those systems. You absolutely have to have non-white populations involved in the design of those systems and also in establishing the policy standards by which these systems are implemented. And as Mr. Eugene said, if you're going to roll out a biometric system and say, that's it, everybody has to be registered and receive a national ID, we're going to take biometric data from everybody, well then, if there are people that are unable to register for whatever reason, be it lack of electricity, a lack of whatever, then those people become further marginalized, further discriminated against, because they're not part of the system now and they are excluded. Countries need to be thinking about all of those things when they're deciding to roll out these systems. One other point, therefore, if anyone is thinking biometric systems are kind of, the panacea to all of the problems in the world's identity systems. There's a lot of political issues here that I think some countries forget about sometimes. As I mentioned, most private sector companies that design and roll out and invent biometric systems are global north companies from the global north. And I honestly don't think, let me ask the question, is it politically acceptable for a lot of countries that they may subcontract or contract a foreign technology company to come in and register everyone and take their biometric data that then may well be kept on a server or on a database in the country from where that foreign technology company has come? I don't think that's politically acceptable. It would absolutely not be acceptable, for example, if all of the Irish people's biometric data was kept on the server of a British private sector company that was contracted by the Irish government. That would not be politically acceptable in my country. And if that's not acceptable in my country, why should it be acceptable in any of your countries if your government is contracting foreign technology companies? So where data and biometric data is actually held, it does seem to me that it should be an absolute standard that data is at least kept physically within the borders of the country that's contracting a foreign company to provide that system. And so finally on this one, we are coming together as a UN system now. We've started developing a general set of principles around the use of biometric technology that we hope, if we agree amongst ourselves, meaning UNICEF, UNHCR, UNDP, etc., we can then go to the member state organs of the UN, including the United States and all these other countries, and get them hopefully to approve a set of principles around the use of biometric technology. And to give you an example of what we're talking about, in terms of facial recognition systems, many countries have announced already publicly they're moving to a system where they will be automatically taking facial recognition data of all incoming migrants in years to come. So that at least if they have concerns around the validity of somebody's document, or they're concerned that that person, that migrant might turn up again in a couple of years with a fake identity document or some other form of identity document, at least by having the facial recognition data, you'll at least know it's the same person. Who is the person? That they won't necessarily know. They might not necessarily know which identity document is fake, but at least by having facial recognition data, they might at least know it's the same person. So you can see how that's very attractive for some countries. But we think it's absolutely unacceptable, for example, that Islamic women, for example, as a cultural group, should be in a position in an airport where they're being forced to lift up their veils and identify themselves in front of a room full of hundreds of people, including by foreign men that are unknown to them. We just don't think that's right. We think there should be accommodation made for cultural standards, deeply held cultural traditions and practices that allow some people to opt out of a mandated use of something like facial recognition, which at the end of the day is incredibly invasive and incredibly intrusive. The big difference between somebody taking your digital thumbprint is that at least you know when your thumbprint is being analyzed because you're being told, put your thumbprint on a digital reader. But nobody knows when their face is being checked by a facial recognition system via CCTV cameras that are all over the streets, etc. And that, by its very definition, makes it an incredibly invasive, intrusive form of technology. And there must be standards around this use. San Francisco, I understand, has actually banned use of facial recognition across all of its public administration systems now. And I do think you will see a greater movement towards that in years to come. And again, it's an example, I think, where the world can come together and try and set these standards.
Neil, thank you very much. I'm reminded of, conversations around the use of AI, right, in all this in facilitating. But I guess, not everything that glitters is gold, as they say. And I guess not all forms of technology are useful for us to solve some of the, very important problems that we have had in terms of, this particular objective, which tries to look at legal identity, So I guess what we're saying in a nutshell is, can we go back to what is actually also useful for the migrant at the end of the day, and what's useful for all of us? I think some very important reflections that you have brought out in terms of the use of innovative technology there, and legal identity for migrants or nationals. Nana, any reflections?
I think just riffing off of what you just said, Patty, what is the purpose of all of this? What's the purpose of the identity? And I think that, what we have to face is that the purpose of legal identity for migrants for so long, and up until now, is really to be able to organize and, categorize migrants, and particularly when we're talking about Black migrants, migrants of color, for the purposes that suit empire, right? For the purpose of, whether that be for work or, who should stay in, who should get out, surveillance, as Neil just pointed out, right? So all of that has been really what identity has been about, and not about a way for migrants to be able to be safe as they operate and move through. And when I say safe, I don't mean police safe, right? I mean having a way of showing their belonging, of showing their connection, as opposed to what identity really is meaning in the world of migrants, and particularly migrants of color right now, which is a way of, a means of excluding, right? The process is a means of excluding, a means of policing, a means of separating. And so I think when we're thinking about, anytime we're thinking about setting up systems with respect to identity or pushing back against these notions of identity, we should do so from the, centering the people who are the most disproportionately negatively impacted by the rules, the processes of legal identity right now, and really address the issue and attack the issue of why this need for identity exists. And is there a way that this can be something that is rooted in the need of migrants? And, from our perspective as Baji, if it can't be rooted in the need of migrants, then we don't need it, because then it just becomes something, again, that's policing, that's dehumanizing, that is separating and excluding migrants in ways that are not acceptable.
Anna, thank you. In talking about where it should be rooted, right? Back again to the needs and how it's serving migrants. I was going to call upon Dr. Raj to just give us like a 2-minute reflection, knowing that we're running out of time. Dr. Raj, are you available to give us your reflections? Okay, maybe we may have lost her, and then we can give her. Oh, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay,
yes,
well, thank you very much to the 3 panelists. I think the discussion has been very, very useful, as you can see from comments in the chat. What I want to say is that it has, in a way, focused on the use and abuse of technology. Of course, technology is all along, we cannot do without it. To what use it is put, there are lots of questions to that. And continuously we're surveilled. Whether you use your phone, you're recording where you're calling from. Whether you use your computer knows why you did log from there and why did you log from some other place. So that is a baggage that we all have to carry now. But coming to how it affects migrants, the issue of having some form of identification and their ability to access. And before they leave home, before they go to host country, in fact, the host country has an obligation. Passport is a means to allow you to travel, to determine that you are the person who has a ticket and the ticket belongs to you, at least the name is the same. The rest they don't know, okay, and they let you go. Now the challenge is when you land, when you enter, and when fake passports, I know people who have taken somebody's photo before the biometric came into play and replaced using the credentials of the other person, and that's just changing, putting his or her own photo. And when you get to the other side, and of course the passport officer knows, and then what do? He has to deport you, right? So you are deported, you are penniless, you don't know where you're going, not to talk about the emotional and the other pain that you feel, that you're going back and you've spent a lot of money. So in order to protect would-be migrants, it is, I think, pre-departure, there should be some way of knowing that the person has the correct documents as requested or required of. Because, I mean, you're a bagger, you're not a chooser. These are the laws of the land, and you have to respect the laws of the land, okay? So these are the requirements. Now, biometric is everywhere, in most, even in my own island. Some 10 years ago, I didn't have a biometric passport. But when I went to renew, I think in 2013, by then they had already moved along. Now, the bad thing or the irony of the situation is that the biometrics in the case of small countries are centralized. They are in the capital. So that means you have to either go to the capital, and if you're in a village and you spend a lot of, if you don't have any relative, you have to pay somewhere to stay. And they don't give you the same time. They will not mail you. Well, if you want them to mail, then you have to pay and so on. So this is now the game of the day, biometrics. But as regards protecting migrants, they need to carry the sort of identity which is, and they should be warned of false identities, and that you can be caught. And if I had the time, I'll give you an example of a child who was brought from whatever Central American country into the US, into Texas. And my parents just left him, and he was then staying with his relatives there. And when he went to the child was 5 years old, and he has to go to school because it's mandatory. You have to go to school, and now you have to prove who you are, okay? So he managed to get somebody else's birth certificate and use that person who was either deceased or whatever, the child, and he was working at the border control in the US until he was 25. Because he was going back and forth from Texas to Mexico to see his parents, back and forth. And he was discovered that actually he had used somebody else's, so, and now I don't need to tell you the rest of the story. The life is finished, okay? Because you don't belong to Mexico or wherever he came from because you never lived there. And your parents by then had deceased, and you cannot be in the US. So the point I make, in the interest of the migrants, it is important that some sort of legal documents are provided, and they travel with legal documents which are authentic, which is not to say that private people will not be making money out of this vulnerability. So the idea is to make the migrants' journey and eventual destination less vulnerable. So that is important. As regards, I wanted to say something on birth and death registration. A lot of countries don't have that sort of facilities or requirements. When does a birth certificate become important for a child? If you must go to school, if going to school is mandatory. If in many countries, you don't need to go to school. Well, you go to school, somehow somebody says you're so-and-so and you're X number of years old, and that's what it is. And kids who are born at home, they are not registered. So there are a lot of challenges. So countries have to ask themselves, we need data for what? For planning. We need demographic data. We need to plan where people are going to live, even for internal purposes rather than for external. And down the road, it's possible that people are probably migrating and so on. So you have to start these things with the recognition of the importance of collecting such civil data, because this will guide you. What's the housing situation is going to be like? What's the transport situation? What's the employment situation? So you just can't be working these days without information. So I think, I mean, of course, it's very challenging, and that requires money, that requires setting up ministries or offices, that, and above all, that requires sensitization, that the population has to then realize, yes, it's my obligation now to go and report my child to in the registry where the child has to be registered, because later on I will have X, Y, Z benefits. But if there's nothing, there's no benefit to it, why take, the trouble of going there? And you have to take many buses. There are no at the village level, registries and so on. So I think this is where some sort of sensitization needs to be done about the importance of who you are and who you claim to be and how you must be respected as who you are. And I think, so I mean, there are lots of challenges. So we cannot now blame those who are requiring biometric technology, whether it was, I mean, passport is an administrative barrier to people's movement. In the 15th century, when people were coming to the US, they just came, right? There were no passports, there were no checks, as long as you had the money to buy a ticket, because it was not necessary, again, for whites. It wasn't for free for all, but it was free for whites, until such time that many people migrated, and now they started to think of what sort of barriers can we place, whether it's quota system, passport system, having some relative, having this and that, that is, anyway. So I think I will stop here because we can go on, and in the interest of people's time, and to thank the panelists and to thank you, Patty, for moderating the panel so well. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Thank you, Dr. Raj from GRFDT on those reflections. And with that, again, to just thank all our panelists who have joined us today. I think we have touched on a wide range of topics, even as we managed to dive into the issue of identity, and we will be seeing how this tags along with other topics, whether we will look at, from where we started from, when we think about data, GCM objective number 1, when we will look at vulnerabilities and how to address those, when we will look at access to, migrants having access to basic services, or whether we're going to touch on regular pathways, as we will next week, all the way to speaking about remittances. And somebody in the chat reminded us what happens for identity in relation to return. So that full cycle, what's really happening to the migrant as they are moving along. Do they have the necessary legal identity? Do they have the documentation so that it gives and opens the doors for them to be provided for and for them to contribute accordingly. Thanks again, Nicole, Nana, and Neil, for joining us today and just helping us really unpack GCM objective number 4. And thank you to all the panelists. Again, to all the participants for your very vibrant participation in the chat room. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring more onto the audio, but thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week as we will look at objective number 5 on regular pathways. But as for the students, we'll be seeing you in the classroom on Saturday, and we will send to you all the details with the right timing this time, because as you have noticed, European time has adjusted to winter, and the Americas, I think, will be moving forward as well as of the 8th of November, I understand. So thanks again, stay safe and take care. Thank you. Thanks, Nana. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Nana.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Paddy. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was a nice session.
Thank you.
Ending.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. You can put your questions for the students in the chat room. If there's any further questions, just put them in the chat room and we will react to them. Thank you. Good morning. Good day. Good night.
Thank you, Paddy. Bye-bye.
I think I've ended this. Why is this still?